The decision was delivered without celebration, warning, or compromise. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, King Charles placed his signature beneath an order enforcing the 1917 letters patent with devastating precision. In a single stroke, members of Queen Camilla's private circle were stripped of every disputed HRH right, ceremonial privilege, and royal entitlement they believed had been secured. But the deepest shock was not the order itself. It was Charles's refusal to withdraw it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the order would wound people he had welcomed into his private life. Yet he signed because the boundary around the crown had begun to collapse. The 1917 letters patent, a formal royal document defining who may legally use the style of Royal Highness, gave him the authority to end that confusion. HRH, meaning His or Her Royal Highness, carried more than prestige. It influenced ceremonial rank, official access, security treatment, and how palace staff responded to requests. Camilla received the sealed directive in her private sitting room and read the opening page twice. Her hand tightened around the arm of the chair as each name appeared. The Queen Consort then looked at her senior aide and asked whether her husband had personally approved every removal. The aide hesitated before confirming that the king had reviewed the list line by line. That pause hurt her almost as much as the answer. The consequences were immediate. Charles had ordered the withdrawal of disputed titles, ceremonial precedents, restricted palace access, and privileges previously extended to selected relatives and loyal members of her household. The House of Windsor, the reigning royal family, would now be separated clearly from those connected through affection, marriage, or private loyalty. Years of blurred rank had ended with one signature. Charles remained alone in his study after the papers were carried away. He placed the pen beside the empty folder and refused his private secretary's suggestion that a reconsideration period might soften the blow. The monarch answered quietly that affection could no longer rewrite the rules of the crown. He sounded resolved, but the silence afterward revealed the cost. Camilla soon discovered the order was not aimed at one embarrassing mistake. Several people within her trusted circle appeared on the removal list, showing that the palace intended to dismantle an entire network of unofficial influence. A handwritten notation beside one name referred to months of internal review, proving the decision had been prepared long before that morning. Then, the final shock arrived. Camilla demanded an immediate private meeting and learned that Prince William had already been briefed. She had lost the privileges surrounding her circle, but when she realized the future king knew before she did, shock hardened into something far more dangerous. The order may have been written in the language of law, but its consequences were brutally personal. For Camilla, the names on the list were not distant courtiers. They were relatives, confidants, and loyal companions who had stood beside her through decades of hostility. For William, however, the matter was not about loyalty. It was about protecting the monarchy he would one day inherit. And between them stood Charles, forced to choose between his wife and his crown. Camilla had spent years building a trusted circle around herself. Those people offered security inside an institution that had not always welcomed her, and ceremonial recognition gave them dignity when old resentment still followed the family. A ceremonial position meant an approved place at official events, with defined access and precedence. To the Queen Consort, those privileges were proof that her loved ones finally belonged. To William, they had become evidence that private affection was beginning to shape royal authority. Camilla summoned Tom Parker Bowles to a private room before the wider family heard the news. She remained standing as her son entered, then handed him a brief written notice confirming that his ceremonial position had been withdrawn. Tom read it slowly. He said nothing at first. Then he looked at his mother and asked whether Charles intended to remove them from palace life completely. Camilla tried to answer with confidence, but her voice failed her. She told Tom that family invitations were not yet cancelled and that the king had drawn a line between private relationships and royal status. Yet she could not hide the deeper wound. The queen consort admitted that she had not been consulted before the order was finalized. Her son finally understood the truth. His mother could wear a crown, but even her title could not protect the people closest to her. William faced a different burden. A confidential palace briefing, a restricted report prepared for senior royals, showed that invitations, security clearances, and seating precedents had repeatedly been changed for Camilla's circle without full household approval. Those alterations mattered because they gave private relatives influence normally reserved for recognized members of the monarchy. The future king feared that silence would turn temporary courtesies into permanent claims. Catherine noticed her husband pause outside Charles's study before the announcement. She waited until they were alone, then asked what the king had wanted. William admitted that his father had asked whether he would defend the decision publicly. The prince had agreed, knowing that his support would place him directly against Camilla. Camilla soon rejected the idea that protocol alone had caused such a brutal response. She instructed her senior aide to search private schedules, ceremony records, and recorded staff conversations for the moment that changed Charles's mind. The answer would lead back to one royal ceremony, one unauthorized introduction, and the instant the king realized that his authority had been quietly bypassed. Every palace crisis has a moment that appears harmless, until its true meaning becomes impossible to ignore. For this one, that moment came during a private investiture reception at Windsor Castle. A place had been prepared for senior working royals. The order of precedence had been approved, and every introduction had been carefully arranged. Then Camilla's private secretary changed one name on the final list. What followed lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it pushed Charles toward the most severe decision of his reign. Tension had been building for months. Palace officials had warned that members of Camilla's circle were appearing at restricted receptions, using royal entrances, and receiving courtesies meant for titled members of the family. An investiture reception is a formal gathering held around a ceremony, where honors are presented, and every place inside it carries meaning. Access suggested recognition. Precedence suggested rank. Repeated exceptions were beginning to look like permanent authority. Charles knew the pattern was becoming dangerous, but he hesitated. The king feared that any public correction would humiliate his wife and reopen old wounds she had spent years trying to survive. He ordered quiet changes instead, trusting Camilla to restrain her household before the issue grew larger. She accepted those warnings, yet the privileges continued. Then came Windsor. Tom Parker Bowles entered the reception, expecting a private family role. Instead, an official introduced him to foreign guests, using an HRH-style form of address that had never been approved. HRH, meaning His or Her Royal Highness, is a formal style reserved for specific members of the royal family. It was not a casual courtesy. It carried constitutional weight. Charles heard the words from several feet away. The monarch stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence and turned toward Camilla. She met his eyes but said nothing. That silence changed everything. The king had expected confusion, perhaps embarrassment, even an immediate correction. Instead, the queen consort allowed the introduction to stand. Charles confronted her later, in a side chamber with no aides present. Camilla insisted the wording had been a minor courtesy, intended to prevent awkwardness before important guests. He answered that a royal title could not become a private gift, handed to those they loved. She accused him of treating her family as outsiders. The king replied that affection did not create constitutional rank. William received the evidence that same evening through a documented palace briefing. The revised introduction card had been issued less than an hour before the reception, following instructions traced to the queen consort's office. The prince understood at once that the mistake had been deliberate. Charles ordered a complete review of every privilege granted to Camilla's circle. That investigation uncovered a second arrangement involving permanent ceremonial positions, and it was far more serious than one improper introduction. What began as a title spoken at one reception was now becoming a direct struggle over who had the power to define the royal family. There were no advisors in the room, no private secretaries to soften the language, and no courtiers to interrupt the silence. Charles entered carrying the final review. Camilla was already waiting. Between them lay a marriage built through scandal, endurance, and decades of sacrifice. Yet on that evening, neither spoke as husband and wife. One defended the dignity of those she loved. The other defended the boundary of the crown. Only one of them could prevail. Camilla demanded that the order be suspended before it became public. She called the punishment too broad, and warned that the country would see it as a deliberate attack on her family. The Queen Consort knew the decision mattered, because it did more than remove titles. It cut her relatives away from access, rank, and protection inside the institution she had spent years trying to enter. Charles placed the palace review between them. The document showed that disputed HRH courtesies had shaped invitations, seating arrangements, transport access, and private security decisions. HRH, meaning His or Her Royal Highness, was not simply a decorative style. It could change how officials responded, who entered restricted spaces, and where someone stood during formal events. That was why the king believed the issue had moved beyond embarrassment. Camilla pushed the file away. She accused her husband of allowing William to turn a family disagreement into a constitutional humiliation. Her voice sharpened as she reminded him that her circle had remained loyal when much of the country had rejected her. Those people had stood beside them when every appearance brought judgment, and now the Queen Consort believed they were being punished for that loyalty. Charles removed his glasses and looked directly at her. He said personal devotion could not purchase royal status. The monarch then delivered the line that ended any hope of compromise. He would not leave his heir a palace where titles could be expanded through private pressure. Camilla flinched at the mention of William, because it confirmed that the future king was already part of the decision. Camilla answered with a painful revelation drawn from a recorded private conversation years earlier. She reminded Charles that he had once promised her relatives would never be made to feel like outsiders. To her, the disputed courtesies had simply honored that assurance. The king replied that private acceptance was not constitutional rank, and love could not become law. Charles then disclosed the most damaging discovery. One member of her circle had used HRH-linked access to enter a restricted planning meeting without authorization. That meeting concerned future royal duties, meaning the breach had reached the machinery of the monarchy itself. Camilla asked one final question. Had William demanded the removals? Charles did not answer at once. His silence was enough. The Queen Consort left believing the prince had engineered her defeat, but the true force behind the order held more authority than even the future king. The palace confrontation made the crisis feel personal, but the machinery behind Charles's decision was far older than his marriage, and far stronger than William's influence. The 1917 letters patent had been created to define the boundaries of royal identity during a moment of national pressure. Now, more than a century later, its authority was being used again, not merely as an old rule, but as a weapon of institutional survival. And Charles was not the only person demanding its enforcement. Charles understood that the document gave the crown strict control over who could use the style of royal highness. The letters patent was a formal royal order that defined titles, rank, and membership within the monarchy. Without those limits, private courtesy could slowly become public expectation. Senior constitutional advisors warned the king that unapproved HRH treatment might encourage extended relatives and future generations to demand the same recognition. Princess Anne entered her brother's study, carrying a marked copy of the Household Review. She placed it on the desk and waited until Charles looked up. The princess spoke without anger, but her calmness made the warning heavier. She told him that delay would not protect Camilla. It would only make the eventual correction more humiliating for everyone involved. Charles admitted what he had avoided saying aloud. He feared breaking his wife's trust. The king knew Camilla had survived decades of public hostility, and he understood why she surrounded herself with people who never abandoned her. Yet Anne refused to let sympathy settle the matter. She said the queen consort might eventually forgive a husband's firmness, but the monarchy might never recover from a monarch who refused to defend its boundaries. Anne then disclosed what palace staff had recorded in the household review. Junior officials had begun sending requests from Camilla's circle directly to her office because they were frightened of challenging people believed to hold royal rank. The princess explained that fear had already changed how the palace operated. Private relatives were no longer simply receiving kindness, they were gaining influence because staff believed refusal could bring consequences. Charles turned to the final pages and found the most dangerous proposal yet. 2 members of the queen consort circle had been considered for permanent ceremonial positions. These roles would have given them an official place at major events and allowed their influence to survive beyond his reign. The king realized the problem was no longer temporary. It threatened the structure William would inherit. Charles called for the decree. With Anne's warning and William's support behind him, he ordered immediate distribution. Every affected person would surrender badges, access cards, ceremonial designations, and disputed privileges before midnight. The argument had ended inside the palace, but the real punishment began when those named in the order were forced to return the symbols they had come to believe were theirs. Royal status is often imagined through crowns, balconies, and grand ceremonies, but its removal happened through smaller, colder gestures. A security pass stopped working. A name disappeared from an official list. A car was redirected from a private entrance. One by one, Camilla's closest allies discovered that the king's order was already active. There would be no grace period and no discreet delay. By nightfall, the palace that once welcomed them had begun treating them as outsiders. Palace officials moved with brutal speed. They cancelled ceremonial access, revised forthcoming guest lists, withdrew HRH-linked correspondence, and instructed security teams to treat Camilla's relatives as private individuals. Ceremonial access meant permission to enter official royal spaces and attend events under recognized palace status. Losing it mattered, because it stripped away more than convenience. It removed the silent authority that had once opened doors without question. Staff changes followed almost immediately. Employees who had been assigned informally to members of the Queen Consort Circle were returned to central royal duties. That decision severed the support network that had allowed the group to operate like an unofficial branch of the monarchy. Schedules were no longer managed for them. Cars were no longer waiting. Requests no longer carried the same weight. Tom Parker Bowles arrived for a scheduled family dinner, expecting the usual entrance. His pass failed before he reached the inner corridor. The security officer checked the updated instructions, then quietly told him that his access had been withdrawn. Tom stood still for a moment, removed the badge from his coat, and placed it on the desk without protest. The silence carried more humiliation than anger ever could. Camilla watched her son enter later through the public reception route. She crossed toward him immediately and apologized before anyone else could speak. The queen consort looked shaken, but Tom refused to let her carry the full shame. He told his mother that the humiliation belonged to the palace, not to her. Yet both understood the truth. Her title had not saved him. Laura Lopes received her own blow through a documented telephone notice from the royal household. She was informed that her planned appearance in the royal enclosure had been cancelled. The royal enclosure was a restricted area, reserved for approved senior guests and members of the family. Laura asked who had authorized the change and learned that Charles had personally approved the revised list. Camilla demanded that her office restore both arrangements. The answer came back cold and final. No access could be reinstated without the king's written approval. For the first time, she realized the decree had not only reduced her family's standing, it had also cut into her own institutional power. That evening, Camilla sent a private message to William. She asked to meet without Charles, Anne, or any palace officials present. The prince agreed. For the first time since the crisis began, they would face each other without titles, advisors, or the king standing between them. The meeting was not recorded, minuted, or attended by a single aide. Camilla entered expecting accusation. William arrived prepared for anger. Yet when the door closed, the confrontation neither had anticipated became something more difficult, an honest conversation. She saw an heir terrified of inheriting unresolved chaos. He saw a woman who believed the institution was stripping away the only people she could trust. For one private hour, the battle over HRH rights became a story about fear, family, and survival. Camilla asked the question without delay. Had William pushed Charles to enforce the letter's patent? The prince admitted that he had supported the review, but he denied demanding punishment for personal reasons. The letter's patent was the formal royal order, defining who could legally hold royal styles and rank. To him, the issue mattered, because unclear privileges could become permanent claims if no one challenged them. William then explained what frightened him most. One day, George would inherit not only the crown, but every unresolved conflict surrounding it. The future king could not allow private promises, family loyalty, or old verbal assurances to create rival centers of royal authority. He wanted his son to inherit clear lines of responsibility, not a palace where influence depended on who had once been closest to the monarch. Camilla accused him of seeing her family as intruders. Her voice stayed controlled, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. She said her children had never asked to become political symbols, yet they were constantly treated as if their presence threatened the monarchy. The queen consort waited for denial. Instead, William paused and chose his words carefully. William admitted that he saw them as private relatives, placed in an impossible position by unclear privileges. He did not believe Tom or Laura had created the confusion alone. The prince believed the palace had encouraged expectations, then blamed the family when those expectations became inconvenient. That answer disarmed Camilla because it contained no cruelty. Camilla finally confessed the fear she had hidden for years. She had encouraged ceremonial recognition because she believed her children would always be viewed as proof of scandal rather than members of her family. The queen consort wanted them to feel protected, not powerful. Yet in trying to give them dignity, she had helped create the very crisis now humiliating them. William then revealed what he had argued in a documented briefing to Charles. He opposed removing private invitations or family contact. His recommendation was precise: strip constitutional privileges, but preserve personal relationships. The prince wanted the boundary restored without erasing the people behind it. Camilla understood at last that Charles had followed that distinction. Her circle had lost royal status, but not their place in his private life. She agreed not to challenge the decree publicly. In return, she asked for one final concession. The king must explain the decision personally to everyone affected. The private war had softened, but the monarchy still faced a public reckoning no closed door could contain. By sunrise, the order was no longer a private royal crisis. It had become a national spectacle. Broadcasters interrupted scheduled coverage. Legal experts debated the limits of royal identity. Crowds gathered outside palace gates, some praising Charles for defending the crown, and others condemning the decision as a calculated humiliation of his wife. But one newspaper front page captured the public mood more powerfully than any speech. A single photograph of Camilla beneath 4 words that divided the country. Charles woke to a monarchy already under judgment. National broadcasters described the enforcement as the strongest boundary he had drawn between the crown and the queen consort's extended family since becoming king. That mattered because the decision was no longer being treated as a private dispute. It had become a public test of whether royal affection could override the rules governing status, access, and authority. Buckingham Palace released a brief statement before the morning bulletins ended. The palace declared that royal styles and privileges must follow established constitutional instruments rather than private custom or household expectation. A constitutional instrument is a formal legal document that defines how royal power, titles, and duties are controlled. The language was cold, but its meaning was unmistakable. No personal promise could outrank the crown. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as television crews repeated the statement. Some carried signs praising Charles for protecting the monarchy. Others called the order cruel. Then newspaper copies appeared beneath the lights, each showing Camilla's solemn portrait above the headline, "Queen, but family no more." The words spread faster than the official explanation. Camilla saw the front page before breakfast. She placed it face down and said nothing. The Queen Consort had agreed not to challenge the decree, but silence did not protect her from humiliation. Every debate reduced her private pain to a national argument. One broadcaster gave the crisis its defining phrase. He described Charles as choosing institutional survival over domestic peace. The line was replayed throughout the day, turning the king's decision into a brutal choice between marriage and monarchy. William's role then changed the public mood. Commentators obtained details from a documented palace briefing showing that he had protected private family invitations and personal contact. The prince had not tried to erase Camilla's relatives. He had only demanded that family affection remain separate from royal authority. Anne's support became known soon after through the same recorded briefing. Her involvement convinced many observers that the decree was not one man's revenge, but a coordinated defense of constitutional boundaries. As the anger began to settle, Charles prepared for the final meeting. He would now face Camilla's circle himself and explain the difference between belonging to his family and belonging to the crown. The country had judged the spectacle from outside, but only the king could deliver the final verdict to those whose royal identity had disappeared overnight. The final meeting carried no ceremony. There were no uniforms, no photographers, and no royal introductions. Charles faced the people whose privileges he had removed and spoke not as a distant monarch, but as the man responsible for their humiliation. He did not reverse the order. He did not weaken its language. Instead, he offered a distinction that would define the monarchy from that day forward. They could remain part of his private family, but they would never again be treated as members of the crown. Charles gathered Camilla, Tom Parker Bowles, Laura Lopes, William, and Princess Anne inside a private palace room. The 1917 Letters Patent, a formal royal order defining who may hold royal rank and styles, had now been enforced without exception. The king confirmed that every disputed HRH right, ceremonial place, security privilege, and form of institutional access connected to the Queen Consort circle had been permanently withdrawn. Charles did not hide behind the document. He told the family that he had allowed uncertainty to continue for too long. The monarch admitted that private affection had created expectations the Constitution could never support. His apology did not restore what had been lost, but it placed responsibility where it belonged. He had allowed kindness to become confusion, and confusion had become influence. Camilla listened without interrupting. The Queen Consort looked toward Tom and Laura before answering her husband. She did not ask him to reconsider. Instead, she said she would accept the boundary as long as her children were never treated with contempt inside their own family. Her words carried pain, but also quiet resolve. She had lost the battle over royal status, yet she refused to let humiliation destroy their private bond. William then addressed Tom and Laura directly. The prince assured them that appropriate family gatherings would remain open to them. They would not be erased from birthdays, private dinners, or moments of personal importance, but royal duties, titles, ceremonial authority, and constitutional influence would belong only to those formally recognized by the crown. The future king offered respect, without surrendering the boundary he had fought to protect. Anne accepted responsibility for overseeing the new household rules. The princess would ensure that no private promise again became an unofficial royal privilege. William publicly supported his father, while Camilla closed the network of ceremonial influence that had formed around her circle. The conflict would not pass into the next reign. Charles's decision wounded his marriage, humbled Camilla's family, and exposed years of blurred authority. Yet it also restored the line the monarchy had nearly lost. Love may decide who enters a family, but only duty and law decide who represents the crown. There was nothing left to challenge, and no privilege left to reclaim. The order stood, the family accepted it, and the monarchy emerged smaller, colder, but undeniably clearer about where royal power ended. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.